I transmigrated into the role of the disabled male lead's lost love. It all started a month ago. Rebel troops invaded the royal city, and the city was ablaze with war. The entire royal family was massacred, with only Prince Julian managing to escape through a drainage ditch when his nursemaid distracted the rebels. However, his feet were trampled by horses during the rebels' entry into the city, leaving him disabled. I found Julian 3 days ago downstream of the moat. He was covered in blood and his clothes were dirty and tattered. I carried him on my back from the north of the city to the outskirts of Oakwood Village, avoiding the surrounding soldiers and the piles of corpses. Oh, I forgot to mention, my name is Amelia, and I'm the village beauty of Oakwood Village. I'm also one of the many supporting female characters in this power revenge novel called The Dynasty of Foam. The good news is that I'm not a villainous supporting character, but the male lead Julian's lost love. The bad news is that I die early in the original story. It's really frustrating. Our male lead, this brooding young man I picked up 3 days ago, isn't in a good state at the moment. He's been in a coma for many days, with a high fever that won't go down. When I brought him back, I asked my father to give him a rough wash and then I went up the mountain to gather some herbs. During the war, all the doctors had fled. Even a pampered prince is no different from us ordinary people. Having medicine is already a luxury, so we can't be too picky. But looking at the young man on the bed, his face pale and his breathing weak, I hesitated for a moment. Then I dug up the bottle of fine wine that my father had buried under the tree in the backyard, which he said was for my wedding day. I took a mouthful of the wine and sprayed it on Julian's wounds. Well, even in tough conditions, we still need to disinfect. Julian was woken up by the spray of wine, or more precisely, by the stinging pain of the alcohol. His skin was so delicate that it seemed as if it could be broken by a touch. And it was as white as snow. He was extremely good-looking, with fair skin, red lips, and a pair of sharp eyebrows and star-like eyes. His long and thick eyelashes fluttered slightly like small fans. Just as I was tilting my head to take another mouthful of wine and was about to spray it, Julian opened his eyes. His eyes were as black as ink, shining like precious gems. I was stunned. When I came to my senses, I subconsciously opened my mouth to speak, and the wine trickled down from the corner of my mouth. Julian frowned, as if he had seen something dirty, and turned his face away. This was our first meeting. Many years later, he would tease me about this, saying that I had fallen for his looks at first sight and was drooling over him. I guess his eyesight was bad from the start, mistaking the wine for water and regarding me, a diamond in the rough, as a worthless stone. Julian woke up. After sleeping for almost 7 days, he finally opened his eyes. During this time, my father said more than once that judging from his clothes, he was either rich or noble, and he didn't look like a child from an ordinary family. What's more, I found him near the moat. He was very likely someone from the palace. If he didn't wake up, we should wrap him in a straw mat and throw him into the mass grave. Even if he woke up, we shouldn't be deceived by his good looks and should send him away to avoid trouble. I understood all the reasons, but Julian's legs were broken and he couldn't walk. The fierce horse had trampled his ankles, and then a carriage had run over them again. His lower legs were basically useless. Do you want to eat something? I asked, bringing a bowl of wild vegetable paste to Julian. As expected, the noble young man showed the same disgusted look as when he saw me drooling with the wine. I don't want to eat this, because he hadn't spoken for a long time. Julian's voice was hoarse and rough. He seemed to be startled by his own voice too. It was from this rough voice that something in his chaotic mind, which had been in a coma for many days, gradually became clear. The palace was ablaze, with the glint of swords and the splatter of blood everywhere. The rebels entered the palace and pulled down the royal flag. His father and mother's heads were cut off by Duke Victor. They were dead, and the great Zhou dynasty had fallen. Julian's throat was dry, and so were his eyes. He turned to look at me. His beautiful eyebrows and eyes were filled with darkness and hatred. This hatred wasn't directed at me, but at the traitor who had usurped the throne. Did you save me? Yes, I did. After answering, I paused and added, my name is Amelia. Julian stared at me for a long time. His eyes were filled with a sea of emotions, which made my heart palpitate. He didn't tell me his name. Perhaps in the eyes of someone as noble as him, a country girl like me didn't deserve to know his name. And he even thought it was dirty to look at me. After a long time, Julian's eyes moved slightly, and his gaze fell on the wild vegetable paste in my hand. Give it to me. It's easy to go from simplicity to luxury, but difficult to go the other way. The young man, who was used to eating delicious food, naturally had a hard time getting used to the taste of wild vegetables, but he still frowned and swallowed it all, because Julian knew that he was the only surviving royal blood of the great Zhou dynasty. He had to survive, to avenge this deep-seated hatred, and to cut off the heads of the rebels and restore the legitimate rule. I watched him swallow the wild vegetable paste with difficulty, one mouthful after another. The crease between his eyebrows, which hadn't relaxed since he woke up, became deeper because of the lingering bitterness in his mouth. I poured him a bowl of water. This time, Julian really looked at me. His eyes were cold, not like he was sizing me up, but more like he was examining me. I was a bit annoyed by Julian's stare. Although I'm not a beauty who can topple cities, I'm still quite pretty, you know. If there hadn't been this rebellion a month ago, I might have been able to work as a maid in a wealthy family in the royal city. Of course, as a transmigrator who received a modern education since childhood, I don't consider serving others as an honor. The main reason is that wealthy families pay well. However, I looked down at Julian, who was drinking water with his head down. His lips were moistened by the water, and his handsome face was more beautiful than all the men I had ever seen combined. I didn't know if I had fallen or made progress. After all, a month ago, I might have only served a young master or miss, but now I'm taking care of a prince. Alas, life is really unpredictable, Amelia. Don't tell me you're reluctant to send him away. Before, your father only agreed to save him, but not to take him in, my father said, pulling me aside as soon as I came out of the house. The current situation is very chaotic. People are being wanted everywhere in the royal city. Either former important ministers or nobles. Duke Victor is ruthless and will leave no stone unturned. My father said that maybe Julian was one of the people Duke Victor wanted to get rid of. Duke Victor, the late king's older brother and Julian's uncle, was also the one who led the rebellion this time. A person who can kill his own younger brother for power and wealth. If he found Julian, not only would my family be accused of harboring a fugitive, but the entire Oakwood village would also be implicated. To be honest, my father was right. I was indeed deceived by Julian's good looks. At that time, the reason why I saved the young man among so many people was that he looked at me. It was a glance before he fell into a coma. The surroundings were ablaze with fire. The distant mountains were as black as ink in the night, and the moat was the color of begonias. The world was vivid, but only the young man's eyebrows and eyes were clear and bright. At that moment, a sentence suddenly popped into my mind. Meeting you for the first time was like a lifetime in a single glance. However, no matter how stunning the first meeting was, compared with the lives of my whole family and even the entire village, that person was as light as a feather. My father was right. I should have sent Julian away earlier. Although it was cruel, in his current situation, he had no chance of survival. It was like I had saved him for nothing. But there was no other way. When it came to choosing between one life and the lives of hundreds of people, the answer was obvious. That night, I lay in bed, tossing and turning, unable to fall asleep, because early the next morning, I was going to send Julian away. I packed his bag and stuffed the only 2 pieces of bread left in the house into it. This was all I could do. I couldn't do more. Julian slept in the room next to mine. There was only a wall between us. In the second half of the night, when I was so sleepy that my eyelids were fighting and I was finally about to fall asleep, there was a sudden bang from the next door room. I immediately got out of bed and pushed the door open. What happened to you? It seemed that Julian had accidentally fallen out of bed. He was sitting on the ground, his long hair disheveled and his clothes untidy, with his chest slightly exposed. The rough linen clothes had left red marks on his delicate skin. In the moonlight, he was a beautiful young man. This scene was so alluring that I stood there at the door, stunned. How long are you going to stare? Julian groaned, trying to endure the pain and looking up at me. Come and help me up. To be honest, I didn't understand why he could still order me around in such a condescending and confident manner while being dependent on others. I'm not his servant, and he didn't pay me. Oh no, he did give me something. On the day he woke up, Julian gave me a ruby pendant. It felt warm to the touch and was clear and pure. It was obviously very valuable. I accepted it. After all, who would turn down money? He probably thought that this would offset my favor of saving his life. Or perhaps it was just a reward from a superior to a commoner. Julian was a genuine member of the royal family, and our statuses were worlds apart. This was the unchangeable hierarchy in this ancient world. I felt a bit annoyed. But then I thought that he would be on the streets tomorrow. So I wasn't that angry anymore. I went up to help him and asked casually, "What were you doing? Did you want some water or did you need to use the toilet?" As soon as I finished speaking, the young man's body stiffened awkwardly, and his beautiful face turned slightly red. I didn't think he was blushing because of my touch. He was probably just embarrassed. He really had wanted to use the toilet. "My father isn't at home today. He went to the neighboring Pinewood village to borrow some food. If you need to use the toilet, I can help you." Since Julian's legs were broken, he had been using a chamber pot behind the door these days. He couldn't use the toilet. When he heard my words, his face turned red and then black. Finally, when I squatted down and reached out to hold his legs to carry him on my back, Julian pushed me away with a slap. If I hadn't reacted quickly, I might have fallen forward and hit my face on the door, getting disfigured. He wasn't much better either. Due to inertia, he fell backward, and his forehead hit the corner of the table next to him hard. He was worse off than me and was even bleeding. The red blood trickled down from his forehead to the center of his eyebrows. Perhaps a young man like a lotus under the seed of guanine would look like this. But Julian was not a god after all. He still had to answer the call of nature. I stared at him and said slowly, "No matter how angry you are, you can't pee on yourself." Julian seemed even angrier. To be more precise, he was ashamed and angry. His face turned bright red, and the blush spread to the back of his ears. Finally, he was defeated by his physical needs and reluctantly obeyed. I carried him out and put him on the chamber pot. The sound of his urination inevitably reached my ears. I didn't care much, but Julian rarely dared to look me in the eye. Yes, it wasn't the previous disdain, but fear. This change made me feel inexplicably happy. I pursed my lips, but then I remembered that he was leaving tomorrow. So I suppressed the smile on my lips. The sky in the east turned white, and the night ended. My father came back with a large sack of things, including food and a newly made quilt. Due to the war, everyone's fields had been trampled and burned, and most farmers didn't have a good harvest this year. But winter wouldn't be postponed because of the war. We had to prepare for the winter as soon as possible. "Tell him to leave quickly," my father urged me again as soon as he entered the house. I nodded slightly and then went into the house to get the bag with the bread to give to Julian. After all, I was the one who saved him, so it should be me who told him to leave. But it took some courage. I looked at the young man sitting by the window. His loose trouser legs covered his deformed calves. Sensing my gaze, Julian's face darkened, and he gave me a cold look. "If you look at me like that again, I'll gouge out your eyes." Well, I wasn't feeling that reluctant anymore. I took a deep breath and was about to tell Julian that he had to leave, and there was a sudden burst of intensive footsteps outside the door. Then someone started banging on the door. "Open the door." Routine search. Julian and I both froze. He gave me a deep look. His eyebrows and eyes were gloomy, and I didn't know what he was thinking. I didn't have the mood to think either. The room was so small that there was nowhere to hide. As soon as the door was opened, we would be discovered. At that moment, I was extremely anxious. As the knocking on the door got louder and louder, I gritted my teeth. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw the chamber pot by the door that hadn't been emptied yet. Desperate times call for desperate measures. "I'm really sorry." Julian's pupils constricted when he saw me suddenly lift the chamber pot. With a crash, the contents of the chamber pot poured down on him from head to toe. After pouring it, I didn't have time to care about his reaction. I immediately put down the chamber pot and stretched my neck to answer outside the door. Coming. As soon as I opened the door, the pungent smell made the two soldiers who were about to enter the house cover their noses and step back several steps. "Ugh! What's this smell? It stinks. Ugh! Did you shit your pants?" No, sir, that's not the case. I'm clean." It was my younger brother, Tommy. He was so scared when he heard you knocking on the door that he accidentally knocked over the chamber pot on himself. I waved my hand and stepped aside to let them see Julian, who was covered in filth and whose face was hard to see. Cough. You can go in and search. After you're done, I'll clean him up and change his clothes. The two soldiers looked extremely disgusted. When they heard me say they could go in, their expressions were like they were shouting, "Get back." No. No. Your room is so small. We can just take a look from outside. The other soldier nodded repeatedly. Yes. We've seen enough. We're leaving. Ugh. Hey. You haven't even searched the house yet. I shouted to keep them, but when they were out of sight, I finally felt relieved and patted my chest. I closed the door and turned around, and suddenly met a pair of eyes full of anger. Amelia. This was the first time he had called my name in such a long time. His voice was full of emotion, full of energy, and gritted his teeth. After this episode, one really couldn't send him away right after pouring the chamber pot on him. So, the plan to send Julian away had to be postponed. Since then, he has treated me even worse. Get out of the way. You're blocking my light. The food is too salty. This isn't the paper I want. Go buy another one. You don't need that much water for grinding ink. I couldn't stand it anymore. Finally, when Julian picked on me for the nth time, I slapped the table. Sir, can you be reasonable? Am I your savior or are you mine? Even if it was wrong for me to pour the chamber pot on you before, the situation was urgent. Did you want to be caught? Julian seemed surprised that I would lose my temper. Before, it was always others who had to please him. No one had ever shouted at him. He pursed his thin lips, wanting to refute but feeling that he was in the wrong. But if he just let it go, he would feel wronged. Julian stared straight at me, his eyes like obsidian in the sunlight, shimmering with a captivating glow. Finally, he said nothing and lowered his head to continue writing with the pen. What he wrote didn't really look like proper characters. They were just a mass of radicals and strokes, densely packed together, seemingly following some kind of pattern, but I couldn't understand them. I guessed that he was writing letters to contact his former subordinates, gathering strength to attack the palace. 3 days later, as I was hesitating at the door, intending to ask Julian to leave again, the soldiers came once more. This time, it wasn't just a couple of them, there was a large crowd. Oh no! I was startled. I pushed the door open, planning to tell Julian to hide, but when I opened the door, the room was empty. There was no sign of the young man. Julian had left. He was probably taken away by his subordinates who came to look for him while my father and I were working in the fields. I heard that those letters I couldn't understand had not only reached his former subordinates but also been intercepted by some of Duke Victor's men. So they came after me and the entire Wangjia village. Not finding Julian, they simply set fire to the village and the surrounding forest. Finally, when we were at our wits' end, almost starving to death in the mountains, my father called for help from the people in the neighboring Lijia village. They rowed boats over from the direction of the moat. My father, the villagers, and I got on the boats. The firelight illuminated the river brightly. In the distance, our home was burning in the fierce fire and finally collapsed. I stared blankly at this cruel scene, and my eyes gradually filled with tears. In my blurred vision, I felt a gaze from not far away. I wiped away my tears and looked in the direction of the hill. Julian was sitting in a wheelchair. When I looked up, he turned his face away, just like when he first opened his eyes and saw me. He avoided my gaze. I end the 36th year of the Great Zhou dynasty. Prince Julian led his troops and advanced southward from the north. In less than 3 years, he captured several cities. He pressed on with irresistible force and marched straight into the royal city. He executed the traitorous officials and rebels and ascended the throne. He changed the name of the dynasty to Feng and declared a general amnesty for the world. This was the original ending of the story. But it happened 2 years earlier. I remembered that in the story, Julian became king at the age of 20, but now he was only 18. However, this had nothing to do with me. Since the young man left me and the villagers 3 years ago, I had no feelings for him anymore. I thought that in this life, Julian and I, one in the fields and the other in the court, would never have any intersection again. But fate played tricks on us. Things didn't go as I wished. I end the winter of the 36th year of the Great Zhou dynasty. It snowed heavily. A large group of palace servants came to Wangjia village from the palace. They bestowed boxes of jewels, gold, and silver, and also granted mansions and fields. Finally, an imperial edict was announced, summoning me to the palace. I didn't want to go to the palace at all, and I especially didn't want to see that ungrateful Julian again. But I had to obey the imperial order for fear of implicating the village. So I packed my belongings reluctantly, got into the sedan chair, and left with them. They carried me to a palace called the Cloud Flow Palace. It was incredibly large, big enough to fit 2 Wangjia villages. There were red corals, agates, and pearls. There were also many things I didn't recognize, making the palace shine brightly and look magnificent. I was a bit greedy for money. With so many treasures in front of me, I was dazzled. Among them, there was a cloud-shaped hairpin with a gradient of blue and purple. The color was rare, and it was exquisitely made. I couldn't resist reaching out to touch it. "Do you like it?" Before my hand could touch the hairpin, a deep and hoarse voice suddenly came from behind the screen. I was startled and quickly withdrew my hand as if I had been electrocuted. Looking inside, through the screen, I could still see the young emperor. Tall and slender like jade. He hesitated for a moment, then slowly walked out from behind the screen, limping slightly. It was Julian. Compared to 3 years ago, he seemed thinner but also taller. His originally delicate and beautiful eyebrows and eyes had lost some of their immaturity. His facial features were more defined, with bushy eyebrows and sharp eyes. Looking imposing, he was wearing a bright yellow robe embroidered with 5-clawed golden dragons. He had an air of authority even when not angry. Just one glance from him carried an invisible pressure. Was this the so-called aura of a king? Now, although he could walk on the ground, it was with the help of 2 wooden legs made by a palace servant. The lower part of his calves had already necrosed and been amputated. Every step he took was as painful as walking on blades. I only learned this later. "Your Majesty." I clumsily performed the palace etiquette that I had learned from a nanny on the way here, about to kneel down to Julian. But before my knees touched the ground, a hand with distinct knuckles grabbed my wrist and pulled me up. I looked up in surprise and met his eyes. The young man's eyes held more secrets than 3 years ago, and they were even more difficult to fathom. "You don't have to call me your Majesty." His Adam's apple bobbed, and he stared straight at me, saying hoarsely, "I'm Julian." This reunion after a long separation was different from my impression of him being arrogant and condescending. He didn't call himself I in the imperial way, nor did he avoid my gaze. He faced me with a solemn and even somewhat nervous look, standing in front of me again, no longer looking down on me. He told me his name, which I had waited 3 years to hear. With great earnestness, Julian realized that he had fallen in love with me on the 10th day after leaving Wangjia village. He thought that everyone would be as calm as I was when they saw his distorted and hideous legs. They would treat him like a normal person with sound limbs, without being overly cautious. They would know that he was picky about hot food and would deliberately cool his meals for him. They would secretly come to massage his legs every night before going to bed. Only this girl, would wholeheartedly treat him well without knowing who he was. Day by day, when we were together, he didn't pay much attention to these things. He didn't even really look at me. In Julian's eyes, I was just a country girl, a low-class commoner. He was from the royal family, and his innate arrogance was hard to change. But after leaving me, he found that this commoner he had always looked down on had somehow crept into his mind, taken root, and was constantly with him, hard to get rid of. When he read books, he would subconsciously look across to find that figure. When he wrote, he would imitate me and add a little more water. Every time he saw a jade pendant, he would think of the way my eyes curved into a smile when I accepted it. So, thinking of me became a habit. Julian had to keep himself busy, fighting wars and restoring the legitimate rule, from 1 year to the 3rd year. But the more he suppressed his feelings, the stronger they became. He knew that I couldn't forgive him for leaving me behind that year, if it hadn't been for the people in Ligia village risking the fire to rescue us. Everyone in Wangjia village would have perished in the disaster he brought. At that time, Julian didn't think he had done anything wrong. Great people don't worry about trifles. He had been detected by Duke Victor. If he took the villagers with him when he left, it would only alert the enemy. He had decided to abandon me. A person like him shouldn't appear in front of me again. But when he learned of my whereabouts from his subordinates again, Julian still summoned me to the palace. When I entered the Cloud Flow Palace, Julian traced my outline through the screen and paid attention to my every move. This palace was built for me. The decoration, layout, and rare treasures inside were all things I liked. Julian stared at me greedily, as if he could never get enough, just like that. I was locked in the golden cage called the palace by Julian. Normally, a woman summoned to the palace would either become a concubine or a palace maid. But I was an exception. I had no title or status. Julian didn't confer any title on me, nor did he favor me. He just came to my place to sit every day after court. I didn't talk. And he didn't either. Sometimes we could sit facing each other like this for a whole day without saying a word. Days passed like this. It was so boring that I almost counted the number of flowers in the imperial garden. Thank goodness. A new person came to the palace. Now that the Feng dynasty had just been established, and Julian had just ascended the throne, the remaining rebels of Duke Victor had not been completely eliminated. And after years of war, the world was in ruins and needed to be rebuilt to stabilize the country. Since his enthronement, Julian hadn't even held a draft of beautiful women for the harem. So far, except for me, the harem was empty. I didn't have deep feelings for Julian from the beginning. I didn't even like him, let alone love him. I'm just a person who likes good-looking people. I'm quite tolerant of good-looking people. There's no way good looks matter. So, to be honest, I only liked Julian's face. It was pleasing to the eye. But that was my thought 3 years ago. Now, he's the last person I want to see, since I don't care about him. I'm more than happy to have a new person to chat and relieve my boredom. I heard from the palace maid that the person who entered the palace this time was the daughter of the Prime Minister and had been taking care of Julian for the past few years. That girl was 17 years old, 1 year younger than me. Her name was Lily. She entered the palace because there would be a plum appreciation and snow viewing banquet in the palace next month. And Lily was the main person in charge of the banquet. It was more convenient to prepare in the palace in advance. Who would believe that? The Prime Minister's mansion is also in the royal city. How far could it be from the palace? The palace maid Gary, who served me personally, was arranged for me by Julian. The others were too respectful, and I didn't like it. Gary's straightforwardness suited my taste. But there were also times when she gave me a headache. Like now. Miss, you have to be careful. Before, there was only you in the palace. And it was okay. But now that Miss Lily is here, she's definitely after the Emperor. Don't be deceived by her appearance. I didn't pay much attention to Gary's words. This was a power struggle story, not a palace intrigue drama. How could there be so much scheming? On the first day Lily came to the palace. Before I could go out, the girl came to visit me first. No wonder Gary was so vigilant. Lily was really beautiful. She had arched eyebrows like distant mountains, peach blossom eyes, red lips, and white teeth. She also had an oval face that I, with my round face, envied. She was wearing a long, green fairy-like dress, with a thin white shawl on the outside. She stood there gracefully like a lotus in summer. Paying my respects to Miss Wang, I quickly helped her up. No need. No need. I'm not a concubine. I'm just a commoner. Miss Lin, you're flattering me. Unexpectedly, she smiled and said, not now, but you will be in the future. Her tone was meaningful and very certain. Miss, what you said, you might have misunderstood my relationship with His Majesty. I only had some kindness towards His Majesty many years ago. We're not even friends. I paused here, remembering the way Julian used to look at me like I was nothing but dust and ants. Perhaps being friends with him was beyond my reach. Lily was stunned when she heard this. Miss, why would you think like that? His Majesty She wanted to say something but held back. Forget it. Miss, the weather is so nice today. Let's go for a walk near the garden. Although I was tired of the Imperial Garden, I couldn't refuse an invitation from a beauty. Lily and I walked and chatted. I originally wanted to ask her about the interesting things outside the palace. But this girl talked about Julian all the time. She talked about how Julian was a brilliant military strategist in the past, capturing cities, and how he could spot spies with great care. Then she also mentioned some of his favorite foods and the places he often went in the palace. When I was almost at my limit and wanted to interrupt her, Lily suddenly sighed and looked sad. His Majesty has been in a bad mood recently. If you're willing, miss, please talk to him more. I didn't understand what Lily meant by that, but I just wanted to avoid trouble. So I casually agreed. On the second night, it snowed heavily. The snow covered the solemn and magnificent palace with a layer of white, and there was no other color between heaven and earth. I was sitting by the window, holding a hot water bag and watching the snow. Gary, let's have lamb hot pot tomorrow. The person beside me didn't answer for a long time. Just as I was about to turn my head, a big hand suddenly hugged me around the waist from behind. It was a cold embrace mixed with the wind and snow. The scent of ambergris in my nostrils and the pattern of 5-clawed golden dragons on the sleeves clearly revealed the identity of the person. It was Julian. My body stiffened, and I didn't dare to move. Your Majesty, what are you doing? Amelia. Call me by my name. Amelia. No one had ever called me so affectionately except my father. He had been drinking tonight. His head was buried in my neck, and the breath he exhaled when speaking was scorching hot, making me catch my breath. Your Majesty. Julian hugged me even tighter, as if he wanted to crush me into his bones. When I was blushing and almost out of breath, he pressed my shoulders and turned me around forcefully. We stood face to face. He lowered his head, his eyes deep, and his thin lips were as sharp as a blade. Julian's hand slowly moved from my shoulder to the back of my neck. His hand was also very hot. The rough fingertips gently stroked my skin, as if he was playing with a piece of fine white jade. What do you think of Lily? Was he going to take a concubine? If so, he should just choose someone to his liking. Why ask me? But then I thought that if Lily entered the harem, my burden would be much less. Julian might not come to my place every day after court. Over time, he might forget about me. And then I could find a chance to run away. I quickly nodded and started to praise her. Good. Very good. Miss Lin is intelligent and kind-hearted, and her appearance and character are excellent. Your Majesty, having her by your side to share your concerns would be wonderful. As I spoke, I gave him a thumbs up and showed my first smile since entering the palace unexpectedly. As soon as I said this, Julian's face darkened visibly. His caressing motion stopped, and a cold voice came from above. You want me to take her as a concubine? Before I could answer, Julian grabbed the back of my neck and pulled me forward. I let out a cry. When I reacted, my forehead was already touching his. His breath sprayed on my face, and he stared straight at me. I already have you, Amelia, as my beloved concubine. Why would I need anyone else? Alarm bells rang in my heart. I realized that things were not going well. Here we were, a man and a woman alone, and he had been drinking. This was definitely a sign of trouble, like a spark about to set off a fire. I was so panicked that I pushed Julian away with all my might. Normally, a man is much stronger than a woman, and he should have only taken a step or two back. But the young man fell to the ground with a bang. There was a table right behind him, on which was a pot of just boiled hot tea. Julian hit the corner of the table, and the boiling water splashed onto his dragon robe, as well as his hands and legs. He let out a muffled groan of pain, bit his lips, and looked up at me. The corners of his eyes were red, and his body was slightly trembling, just like the plum blossom pressed by the snow that I saw outside the window. Trembling in the wind. I was both flustered and scared. Now Julian was the emperor, and if I hurt him, it was a capital crime punishable by beheading. I'm sorry. I thought you could stand steady. I quickly squatted down to check his burns. His hand was red, and his clothes were soaked and darkened. And his legs. Right. His legs. I clearly saw that almost a whole pot of boiling water had been poured on them. That was the worst hit area. I didn't care about anything else and reached out to lift his trouser legs. Julian's pupils constricted, and he tightly grabbed my wrist with a look of horror in his eyes. No, I'm fine. How could you be fine? That water was so hot. Gary just brought it in. I frowned, not understanding what was wrong with Julian. He used to be so straightforward. If he wanted something or was uncomfortable, he would never endure it and would always order me around. I could only attribute this to the fact that things were different now. He was now the emperor, the supreme ruler, and he probably didn't want a country girl like me to see his body. I pursed my lips in dissatisfaction at this thought. Fine. If you don't want me to see, then don't. Julian hadn't recovered from the shock. When he heard me say this, he was stunned for a moment. He seemed to realize that I might have misunderstood something and was about to explain. stuttering with his lips, seeing me suddenly stand up and head towards the door. He said, "Don't go." He couldn't get up immediately, so he crawled over on his hands and grabbed my dress. "Where are you going?" I was startled, looking at Julian with red eyes and bulging veins on his forehead. I shrank my neck. I'm going to call the imperial doctor for you." Julian's expression softened a bit, but his hand on my skirt didn't let go. "No need. Come on. You're so hard to serve. You won't let me help, and you won't let me call the doctor. Your legs were already bad. What if it gets worse?" I had been pent up in the palace, having to see him every day, and finally couldn't hold back my anger after I said that. I immediately regretted my impulsiveness. Julian was no longer the poor and vulnerable young man on the run 3 years ago. He was the emperor now. What I did was treason. If he wanted to, he could kill me with just a flick of his finger. Well, I didn't mean. I was about to apologize when the young man's lips curved into a very shallow arc. It disappeared in a flash, and when I looked again, it was gone. That smile carried a bit of nostalgia and an inexplicable doting, making me feel a little uncomfortable. "Amelia, help me up." "Okay." Julian's voice was as soft as water, and his eyes were gentle, making me recall the first time I saw him. His eyes were so clear then, without any emotion or shadow. Like precious stones, some scenes overlapped with the present, but they were also different. Before, he would order me to help him. Now, it was a request, and a bit of a plea that I didn't refuse in the end. After all, who could refuse the emperor? I thought about this randomly and then went over to help him up and placed him on the nearby couch. Julian sat on it, and his gaze never left me. After a long while, he explained in a hoarse voice, "Lily and I are not what you think. I brought her in to keep you company because I saw you were bored. I wasn't trying to push you away just now. I was afraid of scaring you." What did he mean? I understood each word separately, but when put together, I couldn't make sense of it. Just as I was in a daze, trying to figure it out, Julian slowly lifted his trouser leg. His legs had been amputated below the knees, and a pair of wooden legs were fixed on them. The place where the wooden legs met his knees was rubbed raw, bloody, and had soaked his socks and shoes. Julian wasn't lying. The boiling water had mostly poured on the wooden legs, and only a small part had splashed on his thighs. It really wasn't too serious. "But, your legs." I was so confused that I couldn't organize my words. Julian's large, well-defined hand tightly clenched, and his black hair fell over his shoulders, covering his face. Amputated. These 2 words, so casually spoken, weighed heavily on my heart, making it hard for me to breathe. He said that at that time, he was so overworked that his already bad injury had severely worsened. If he hadn't had the amputation, his life would have been in danger. I opened my mouth, wanting to say something, but my throat seemed to be choked, and I couldn't make a sound. After a long time, so long that the light in Julian's eyes gradually dimmed, he self-deprecatingly tugged at the corner of his mouth. "I told you it would scare you." As Julian spoke, he was about to pull down his trouser leg. I squatted down first and ran my fingertips along the black belt-like thing that fixed his legs, up to the skin of his thigh. His body trembled, and some involuntary moans escaped from his lips. "Does it hurt so much?" I was a little surprised. I remembered that when Julian was at my home, due to limited medical conditions, I saw him use a hot dagger to remove the rotten flesh. He gritted his teeth and didn't make a sound throughout the process. But now, just a touch from me made him react like this. A faint blush appeared on the young man's face. With the snow outside and the light from the stove in the hall, the colors blended harmoniously, making his usually gloomy eyebrows and eyes look surprisingly gentle. "It doesn't hurt." Julian avoided my eyes guiltily. "It shouldn't hurt this much. It was just itchy, like ants biting, densely packed," making him feel unbearably itchy. I was just too soft-hearted. Seeing him like this, I lost my temper. I should really change this habit. I told myself this in my heart, but I still took a handkerchief and carefully wiped the water stains on his body, his hands, and his clothes. Then I used a clean part of the handkerchief just as I was about to wipe his face subconsciously. I stopped. "You can do the rest yourself." He didn't have legs, but he had hands. Julian's eyes moved slightly. When I handed him the handkerchief, he suddenly leaned closer, and his face pressed against my palm through the handkerchief. His long hair was like a waterfall, and it slid smoothly through my fingertips. He looked at me with burning eyes, then gently rubbed against my hand in a somewhat flattering way. He let out a deep sigh and said, "Amelia, I miss you so much." Afterwards, I learned that the day Julian broke into my palace was the anniversary of his parents' death. He was so drunk that he hugged me, crying and making a ruckus, alternately apologizing and thanking me. It was quite a spectacle. That was also when I suddenly realized that no matter how powerful and domineering Julian was on a daily basis, he was still just an 18-year-old boy. In the following days, Julian didn't come to my place as often as before after court. Maybe he felt too embarrassed about his forget oneself. Or maybe he didn't know how to face me after blurting out his true feelings while drunk. Time passed quietly. As December drew to a close, the Plum Appreciation Banquet arrived. All the important officials, their families, and influential people in the Feng dynasty came to the palace. The place for the Plum Appreciation snow viewing was in a plum garden. There were guests everywhere, and the wine cups and plates were clinking. The charcoal fire was burning brightly, and there was a wide variety of delicious food and fine wine. It was very lively. I sat next to Julian in the main seat, the seat reserved only for the Empress. He had left it for me. For a moment, the expressions of the officials were diverse, and their eyes were filled with complex emotions. I felt extremely uncomfortable in this situation and wished I could lift my skirt and run away. However, I was quickly attracted by the beautiful scenery of the plum garden. Lily really lived up to her reputation as a talented woman in the royal city. The dishes she prepared were delicious, and the wine was mellow. The seats at the banquet had a wide view, and the snow-covered plum blossoms were in full sight. The white plum blossoms were spotless, the red ones were gorgeous, and the green ones were fresh. All kinds of plum blossoms were blooming freely, and the mountains were covered with snow. It was so beautiful that it made my heart tremble. I was lost in thought, looking at the plum forest. Julian, on the other hand, was looking at me. "Is it beautiful?" "Yes. It's beautiful." I nodded blankly. "I think so too." My heart fluttered. His eyes weren't looking ahead. He wasn't talking about the scenery, he was talking about me. After a few rounds of drinks, the Plum Appreciation Banquet was coming to an end. I had a low tolerance for alcohol. After drinking a little plum wine, I felt a bit dizzy. I propped my head up and watched the dancers swaying their slender waists gracefully. Among them was a woman in a red dress. She wore a veil over her face, her long silk sleeves fluttering. She stood barefoot on a huge drum, with a string of golden bells tied around her slender white ankles, moving in rhythm with the drum beats. Gary told me that this woman was the most famous dancer of the time. Her dance could enchant the whole city, and countless nobles were willing to spend a fortune just to catch a glimpse of her. I squinted my eyes, trying to see her face through the veil. She seemed to notice my intention. With a smile in her eyes, she lightly tapped her toes and jumped off the drum. The other dancers spun around her as she slowly danced towards me. Her fragrant scent filled the air, and her body was as soft as a willow. It was even more intoxicating than the plum wine I had drunk. With such a beauty and wonderful scenery, I couldn't help but let out a chuckle. I didn't notice the young man beside me suddenly frowning. Julian pursed his thin lips and signaled to the palace servant beside him to make the dancer move farther away. The dancer had long, delicate fingers. She twirled around and took the wine cup in front of me, then nimbly moved behind me. When I saw the cup approaching my lips, I subconsciously opened my mouth. Suddenly, with a snap, she threw the cup to the ground. This was a signal. A group of armored soldiers rushed out from all around. They were the remaining followers of Duke Victor. "Protect the Emperor. Hurry and protect the Emperor. There are assassins." I was jolted awake, and the effects of the alcohol completely wore off. The direction where Julian was had already been protected by soldiers. The dancer brandished a sword and fought with a guard. Swords flashed, and the scene was chaotic and noisy. I was so scared that my face turned pale, and my body froze in place, unable to move. "Amelia." Julian's panicked voice reached my ears through the sounds of swords and shouts. He reached out to take me away, but the guards and palace servants wouldn't let him take the risk. They surrounded him tightly to prevent him from leaving. You bastards. Get out of the way. I order you to get out of the way. The young emperor's eyes were fierce. And he ignored the pain in his legs and kicked a eunuch who was blocking his way. Only then did I come to my senses. Like waking up from a dream. I quickly lowered my head and hid under the table. Not daring to move, kill that dog emperor and avenge the prince. A voice shouted from the crowd. The red-dressed dancer was very skilled. She broke free from the siege and charged towards Julian with her sword. Julian's face was cold. He reached out and took the silver longbow beside him. I huddled under the table, my head in my arms, feeling the cold glint of weapons. Looking up, I saw Julian draw the bow to its fullest. The arrow was fierce, cutting through the air and piercing through the woman's head. Coincidentally, she fell right in front of me, her face covered in blood, staring at me with wide, unblinking eyes. It was so close and terrifying. I let out a scream and quickly backed out from under the table. Amelia, come here. Julian reached out to me, his expression anxious. My mind went blank, and without thinking too much, I started running towards him. However, in the blink of an eye, an unexpected thing happened. A snow-white long sword stabbed towards me from behind. The assassin had hidden behind me and used me as a cover to get close, since he couldn't get close to Julian. At the moment when Julian was about to catch me, he simply stabbed at both of us. It's over. This time, I'm really doomed. I thought I had narrowly escaped death when the soldiers burned the village 3 years ago, but it seemed that death was just waiting for me here. It seemed that my fate as the lost love was to die young. After all, that I couldn't avoid it. In fear, I closed my eyes. Julian hugged me, quickly spun around, and then pushed me hard. With a poochy sound, the sound of the sword piercing flesh could be heard, but the pain I expected didn't come. Your Majesty, call the imperial doctor quickly. I opened my eyes. The assassin had been subdued. Julian was lying in a pool of blood, with a long sword stuck in his chest. His eyes were closed, and he was unconscious. I stared blankly at the scene in front of me, like a fish gasping for air, unable to make a sound or breathe properly. I felt a dull pain in my chest and vomited a mouthful of bloody phlegm. Julian. This was the first time I called his name. It was a heart-rending cry, filled with pain. But he couldn't hear me and couldn't respond. Julian's condition was very bad, even worse than when I carried him back from the mass grave. The sword had stabbed him in a vital part. If it wasn't pulled out, he would surely die. Even if it was pulled out, his chances of survival were slim. I sat numbly by his bedside, watching as the basins of blood were changed one after another, and the palace doctors and servants came in and out. The ministers knelt outside. Although Julian wasn't dead yet, they already put on an expression of extreme grief as if he had passed away. Miss, you haven't eaten for 3 days. If you keep watching over His Majesty like this, your body won't be able to take it, Gary said as she brought a bowl of hot porridge and a few plates of pickled vegetables. Eat a little, otherwise, when His Majesty wakes up and sees you like this, they'll be heartbroken. I moved my eyes slightly, showing a blank expression. Would he be heartbroken? Or would he show a disgusted look and call me ugly? Or maybe neither. Now Julian was like a clam. The most he had talked to me recently was when he was drunk. At other times, he would just stare at me in a daze and look away when I met his eyes. The current Julian was not as domineering and decisive as he was in the original story. But I couldn't deny that this Julian had really made me waver. 3 years ago, he left me behind, not caring about my life or death. He was really heartless. But 3 years later, he risked his life to block the sword for me. Even when he was drunk, he hugged me, begged me not to leave, and cried, saying that he liked me. Maybe that was all true. Finally, the imperial doctor decided to pull out the sword. That day, I didn't avoid watching. I just stared with a pale face at Julian on the bed, bleeding continuously and breathing weakly. He had a high fever for 7 consecutive days and went through life and death situations several times. Finally, he managed to come back from the brink of death. After he was out of danger, I still stayed by Julian's side to take care of him, not for any other reason, but because he had protected me, and I had to be responsible. Although I thought the main reason for all this was him. Those people were the remaining followers of Duke Victor, and they were trying to assassinate him, not me. I was just an innocent bystander who got caught in the crossfire. Forget it. After all, I'm kind-hearted and beautiful, I murmured to myself. Then I picked up a handkerchief, wet it, and wiped his face. I also dipped my finger in water and gently touched his pale and dry lips. Lily was worried that I would be bored staying with Julian all the time, so she would come to the palace every few days to chat with me. How is His Majesty's health recently? He's still the same. The fever has gone down, but he's still in and out of consciousness. The night before yesterday, he had a nightmare and kept calling out for his mother while hugging me. I stopped suddenly, realizing that I had said too much. Under Lily's surprised gaze, I abruptly ended the conversation. Cough. Anyway, he's getting better but not fully recovered yet. But it's not a big problem. What about you? How have you been recently? The girl smiled and said that everything was fine with her. She just said that because of what had happened, she had to go through strict inspections when entering and leaving the palace these days, which was very troublesome. That we chatted about some gossip and shared interesting things that happened inside and outside the palace. As the sky was getting dark, Lily was about to leave. Before she left, she looked at me hesitantly. Finally, she asked the question that was on her mind. Amelia, do you still want to leave the palace now? We were no longer as unfamiliar with each other as when we first met. I called her Lily, and she called me Amelia. You said before that as long as you got the chance, you would immediately pack your things and leave here. Take your father and go into hiding so that His Majesty couldn't find you. Now is probably the best time for you to leave. Given Julian's current situation, if I left, he definitely wouldn't be able to come after me. The chances of me getting away were very high. That I had talked about not liking it here and wanting to leave countless times in front of Lily. At first, she tried to persuade me, but later she just accepted it. Now she was even reminding me on her own initiative. She really regarded me as a friend. Instead of forcing me to stay, she hoped that I would be happy and free. That I in the past, I might not have even needed Lily's reminder. I would have already taken action and escaped. But to my surprise, in the past month, I hadn't even thought about leaving. My mind was filled with the image of Julian being stabbed and falling down. I had no time to think about anything else. After a long time, the snow outside had covered my head. I slightly opened my red lips and replied in a low voice. Let's wait a little longer. Let's wait until spring. Lily's words made me realize that I was hesitating. I was actually hesitating because of this ungrateful Julian. This really shocked me. Although he had saved me, I had also saved him. We were at most even, and we didn't owe each other anything. There were so many people in the palace taking care of him. He didn't lack anything. Why couldn't I just leave without caring? I usually fell asleep as soon as my head touched the pillow, but this was the second time I couldn't sleep. Following the night 3 years ago when I decided to send Julian away, and Julian, on the contrary, woke up completely the day after my sleepless night. Amelia, the young man called me in a hoarse voice. His handsome face had a pale and fragile look because of his illness. What's wrong? Do you need to use the toilet? Julian's face turned red from the top of his head to the base of his neck. This time, he didn't get angry. Instead, he gave me a coquettish glare. You're a girl. Why are you always so outspoken? What was wrong with talking about using the toilet? It was a normal bodily function. I was very confused. Julian let out a slight sigh and didn't continue to dwell on that topic. What were you thinking just now? I called you several times, but you didn't respond. I paused and then shook my head to deny it. Nothing. I was just in a daze. I lied to him. In fact, I was thinking about when to run away. Although, maybe, perhaps, there was a tiny part of me that was a little bit reluctant to leave Julian. But in the future, he was going to marry Lily as the Empress. I was just the lost love in the original story who was supposed to die young. Just because I hadn't died now didn't mean I wouldn't in the future. If I stayed with him, I might encounter danger again and die. I admitted that Julian was good-looking and met all my preferences, but he wasn't important enough for me to risk my life to stay. So, for the sake of a long life, I had to leave. And I had to leave quickly. While I was thinking about the best time to run away, I didn't notice that the young man, who had been gentle just a second ago, now had a gloomy and cold expression. I in the spring of the 37th year of the Great Zhou dynasty. The grass was growing and the orioles were flying. On the 3rd day of the 3rd lunar month, it was a good day to run away. Today, Julian was going to the altar to pray to the heavens. and all the officials were there. The palace servants were busy running around. And no one paid attention to me. Gold and silver were too heavy to carry while running away. I could take a few jade stones, hairpins, jewelry, and banknotes. After packing my bag, I changed into Gary's maid's clothes, a pink and white dress, and planned to escape through a small hole near the Xuanwu Gate. I got this idea from the original story when Julian escaped from the palace during the war. The place was hidden, in a thickly vegetated part of the garden. If you didn't look carefully, you couldn't find the hole at all. I hooking his lips in triumph, carefully pushed aside the grass leaves, and quickly crawled out. Just as I was about to stand up, a pair of black long boots with silver threaded patterns and cloud-shaped borders suddenly came into my sight. Amelia. The voice above my head was as cold as a demon. In the early spring of March, it suddenly felt like the coldest winter, making me shiver. Didn't I tell you that you don't need to kneel when you see me? I failed to run away and was caught on the spot that I was placed under house arrest. This time, it wasn't the Cloud Flow Palace but Julian's Qianqing Palace. At the moment, the young emperor was sitting just a few steps away from me, reviewing memorials. His eyebrows were furrowed, and his eyes were cold. He didn't even spare me a glance that I was sitting on the side, and my buttocks were starting to hurt. I was so bored. I had been forced to stay with this cold-faced guy for several days in a row, and it felt like I was suffocating. So, when Julian wasn't looking at me, I tentatively moved my feet. If you try to run again, I'll break your legs. Do you believe me? This guy was really vicious. He seemed to be jealous of others for having what he didn't. I pursed my lips and retracted my feet. Julian put down his pen, slowly exhaled a breath, and then looked up at me. Come here. I didn't move. He had just threatened me, and now he wanted me to go over. I had my pride. Amelia. The young man softened his expression. After a pause, he showed weakness. It hurts when I walk. Please come here. I hesitated for a long time. Finally, I gave in to his pitiful look, seeing me walk over reluctantly. The corner of Julian's mouth curved up slightly. I happened to notice it. You're bullying me. You're beautiful and kind-hearted, right? He looked at me with a smile, propping his head up. My face turned a little red. It seemed that he had heard all the things I muttered to myself by his bedside when he was in a coma. Humph. You'd better know that, although I went over. I sat quite far away from him. Julian propped himself up with his hands and moved closer to me. His body was almost pressed against mine. What are you doing? Stay away from me. He didn't seem to care and just asked in a deep voice, why do you want to leave? Isn't this place good? I thought he wouldn't mention this anymore since he hadn't in the past few days. But he still did. It's good. There's food, drink, and people to serve me. But this isn't my home. I have to go back. This is your home. Julian interrupted me, staring into my eyes word by word. Amelia. As long as you're willing, this palace, and even the whole world, can be yours. He gently took my hand and placed it on his chest. And so am I. I wasn't stupid. Even if I was inexperienced, I knew that Julian's words were a confession. It was like he had broken through that layer of ambiguity, and I couldn't pretend not to know anymore. Miss, don't you like His Majesty? Gary asked. Seeing me in a daze for several days, His Majesty is good-looking and is the Supreme Emperor. Although he's a bit injured, it doesn't affect his ability to have children. Stop. Stop. Don't say such things in broad daylight. I was shocked by her bold words and quickly stopped her. Gary didn't understand what I meant by stop and just scratched her head in confusion, since she couldn't figure it out. She didn't dwell on it. She went back to the original question. So, Miss, do you like His Majesty or not? I really wanted to say no, but I knew that was just a lie to myself. Just thinking about Julian's confession a few days ago made my palms feel hot. I did like him, although I didn't like him as much as he liked me, to the point of risking his life. I still had feelings for him. In fact, the reason I wanted to run away wasn't that I missed home. My father was in the royal city now, and so were the people from Wangjia village. I could see them anytime. A few days ago, Julian even accompanied me back. My father was having a great time drinking and playing finger-guessing games with Uncle Wang. He didn't even seem to remember that he had a daughter. The real reason I wanted to run was that I was scared. I was afraid of another disaster like the one 3 years ago and being implicated again. In short, I was afraid of dying. Staying by Julian's side was too dangerous. And with the early death plot in the original story, the danger level was doubled. So, because of the young man's confession, I had been avoiding him in embarrassment. Always on tenterhooks, fearing another assassination. On the 5th day of the 3rd month, it was my 18th birthday. Julian prepared a birthday celebration for me that was even more grand than his enthronement ceremony. The officials presented treasures, and a grand palace banquet was held with a total of 108 tables. He even invited the people from Wangjia village and Lijia village to the palace. In the evening, when I returned to the Cloud Flow Palace, I saw the mountain-high piles of gifts that couldn't even fit in the room and spilled out to the door. It was both a happy and a bit of a headache situation, probably because of his previous drunken outburst. He rarely drank alcohol now. Today, on my birthday, he only had 2 cups. The evening breeze, carrying a faint smell of alcohol and the strong scent of ambergris from his body, blew gently. He stood behind me and gently put his arms around my waist. Julian rested his head on my shoulder and rubbed his face against mine like a cat. Amelia. Happy birthday. Thank you. Are you satisfied? Are you happy? Yes. I'm satisfied and happy. I was truly touched. Otherwise, in the past, I might have gotten angry if he had been this touchy-feely, but Julian wasn't satisfied with my answer. How can you be satisfied so easily? Aren't you looking forward to what I'll give you? I had been so dazzled by the piles of gifts that I just realized he hadn't given me a present yet. The young man lowered his head and buried his face in my neck, saying sullenly, "You don't care about me at all, after drinking." He became very clingy and coquettish, even if he wasn't really drunk. Just like now, he was unconsciously acting spoiled. I couldn't help but laugh softly, even though it was a very quiet laugh. He still heard it. Julian looked up at me with a resentful expression, looking even more aggrieved. Cough. No, I'm really looking forward to it. I coughed and gently nudged his waist with my elbow. What on earth is it? You're being so mysterious. Julian's eyes moved slightly. He took out a 3-finger wide, cuboid, bright yellow seal and a bunch of keys from his sleeve. What is this? This is the Phoenix seal and the keys to my treasury. The treasury was one thing, but the Phoenix seal. Wasn't that the Empress's seal? I was so shocked that I wanted to pull my hand back. How could I dare to accept this? The young man tightly held my wrist, not allowing me to withdraw my hand. This is my heartfelt gift. You can keep it or throw it away, but you can't reject it. He my clenched fingers one by one and then solemnly placed the Phoenix seal and the keys in my hand. I didn't dare to breathe, for fear of dropping and breaking them. Julian looked at my nervous expression and chuckled softly. If you're like this now, what will you do when you really start giving orders in the future? Your Majesty. Call me by my name. Before, he didn't want to tell me his name. Now, he was extremely insistent on me calling him by his name. I pursed my lips. Okay, Julian. I can't accept these things. You still want to leave. His voice was dry, and the end of his words trembled. Why? Does this place disgust you so much? Or do you dislike me? Do you really hate me that much? Is it because of what happened 3 years ago? I know I was wrong. I won't do it again. Amelia, please stay. I'm begging you. I couldn't stand this side of Julian. I lowered my head and refused to look at him. Only in this way could I find my voice. It's not because of that. It's because I feel that it's too dangerous to be by your side. I'm afraid of dying. And I'm actually not as good as you think. You just met me when you were at your lowest and became a bit dependent on me. When you get tired of me in the future, you'll find that I'm just an ordinary country girl. Nothing special. In fact, I had always been inferior at heart, especially when facing Julian and Lily. They belonged to a different world, noble and elegant, spotless. I wasn't very good looking. My words were vulgar, and my manners were rough. Since I entered the palace, people had been gossiping and mocking me behind my back. Although I pretended not to care on the surface, I actually did. If Julian in front of me was still the one who had fallen from grace 3 years ago, I wouldn't be so conflicted. I might even be glad that his disability could match my humble background. It seemed that only in that way could we be equal. However, all this balance had been broken. Now he was high above, the supreme emperor. There were so many beautiful women who would be eager to be with him if he wanted. It turned out that I wasn't just afraid of death. I was actually suffering from an inferiority complex without even realizing it. I was afraid that as time passed, in Julian's eyes, I his once beloved lost love, would become ordinary and unremarkable. It would be better to leave now, to become the one he could never have when he loved me the most and remembered me the most. Compared to having him for a short time, I preferred him to remember me forever. My hidden and not so nice thoughts were exposed tonight. For a long time, I didn't get a response from Julian. Sure enough, he couldn't be certain whether he liked me or was just dependent on me. And he couldn't guarantee that he wouldn't fall in love with someone else in the future. I self-deprecatingly tugged at the corner of my mouth and stared down at the ground. The moonlight was like frost, covering the ground and making me shiver. So, before we start to loathe each other, I think we'd better cherish ourselves. That way. Before I could finish speaking, Julian grabbed my chin and forced me to look up. His warm lips covered mine. With the smell of alcohol, he forcefully pried open my lips, and our tongues intertwined passionately. My pupils constricted, and I instinctively wanted to push him away, but for some reason, I didn't. I just clenched my fists and held them in front of my chest, trying to keep some distance from him. However, it was no use. The young man was very strong. He held me tightly and pressed me into his arms when I was almost out of breath and on the verge of suffocation. He sucked on my lips affectionately and then bit down hard. I let out a cry of pain. The taste of rust filled my mouth as he swallowed it. His Adam's apple bobbed, and he slowly moved away. Amelia. Julian gasped, calling me by my full name. You're afraid of death, and I'll protect you from all danger in the future. But you're afraid that I'll get tired of you and leave you. So you want to abandon me. That's not fair, because I'm more afraid that you'll get tired of me, and even leave me. His lips were stained with my blood, as red as begonias, and the corners of his eyes were also red. If you're just so, then what about me, who likes you so much and can't live without you? Julian's large hand stroked my face. His rough fingertips gently rubbed my skin, caressing me tenderly. I don't want anyone else. I only want you. I want you to be my Empress. I looked at the young man in front of me, who was hoarsely and persistently begging me to stay. Amelia, please, don't leave me. Maybe it was the beautiful moonlight tonight. Or maybe it was the way the beautiful man in front of me was speaking so touchingly. Okay, I replied softly. Alas, fate really played tricks on people. What a strange turn of events. In the end, the lost love who was supposed to die young, not only survived but also became the Empress.